At 6:43 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron pushed the stick of his Douglas TBD Devastator forward until his altimeter read 50 feet above the Pacific Ocean. Behind him, 14 more torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 8 followed his lead. Every pilot watching their instruments show the same impossible number, 50 feet, at 110 miles per hour, straight at the Japanese carrier Akagi. The Navy's official torpedo doctrine demanded 100 feet minimum altitude. The training manual said anything below 80 feet was suicide. The torpedo's arming mechanism needed at least 75 feet to activate properly. Waldron was at 50. In 37 seconds, he would either prove the Navy's entire torpedo doctrine was wrong, or he would be dead. The Japanese carriers had 68 Zero fighters providing cover. Their anti-aircraft guns could fire 500 rounds per minute. In the last 6 months, they had shot down 89% of American torpedo bombers that attacked them. Waldron's squadron had no fighter escort. They had lost radio contact with their carrier. They were 20 miles from the nearest American ship, and they were flying so low that spray from the ocean waves was hitting their windshields. The Navy had court-martialed 3 pilots for attempting this approach in training, called it reckless endangerment, said it violated every principle of aerial torpedo attack. But Waldron had discovered something in the torpedo's technical specifications that everyone else had missed. A single paragraph buried on page 47 of the manual. A detail about the Mark 13 torpedo's pressure detonator that would change naval aviation forever. In the next 4 minutes, his theory would be tested against the most powerful carrier fleet in the world. If you want to see how one pilot's banned techniques sank 4 Japanese carriers in a single day and changed the Pacific War forever, hit that like button right now. It really helps us share these incredible untold stories from World War II. And subscribe if you haven't already. Now back to Waldron's impossible approach. John Waldron wasn't supposed to be leading this attack. Born on a Lakota Sioux reservation in South Dakota, grew up breaking horses, not flying planes. Joined the Navy in 1924, when most pilots came from Ivy League schools. But Waldron understood physics. 1,100 hours of flight time. 400 hours in torpedo bombers specifically. 0 combat missions. While other squadron leaders focused on navigation and formation flying, Waldron spent nights in the carrier's torpedo storage room with a flashlight and a notebook. He measured everything. The Mark 13 torpedo weighed 2,216 pounds. It was 13 feet 5 inches long. Its warhead contained 600 pounds of TNT. Its maximum speed in water was 33.5 knots. But here was the problem. The torpedo's success rate was 12%. Out of every 100 torpedoes American pilots dropped, only 12 actually exploded against enemy ships. The rest either broke apart on impact with the water, ran too deep and passed under their targets, or simply failed to detonate. The Navy blamed pilot error, said they were dropping from the wrong height, wrong speed, wrong angle. Waldron knew better. He had read every after-action report from Pearl Harbor, from the Coral Sea, from every torpedo attack in the war so far. He had interviewed 31 surviving torpedo pilots. He had analyzed the physics of water entry for different drop heights. His conclusion? The Navy's doctrine was backwards. The manual said drop from 100 feet at 150 miles per hour. Waldron calculated that at that height and speed, the torpedo hit the water at a 17-degree angle. The impact force was 4,200 pounds per square inch, enough to damage the torpedo's steering mechanism 73% of the time, but at 50 feet and 110 miles per hour, the angle was 6 degrees. The impact force dropped to 2,100 pounds per square inch. The torpedo would enter the water like a diver, not a brick. There was just one problem. Flying that low was considered impossible. To understand why the Navy banned Waldron's technique, you need to understand the physics of torpedo bombing in 1942. A torpedo bomber wasn't like other aircraft. The Douglas TBD Devastator weighed 10,100 pounds fully loaded. Its Pratt & Whitney engine produced 900 horsepower, maximum speed, 206 miles per hour, but carrying a torpedo, 115 miles per hour if you were lucky. The torpedo itself created enormous drag. It hung from the plane's belly like a barn door, increasing wind resistance by 340%. This meant the plane handled like a truck on ice, slow to respond, hard to maneuver, easy to hit. Standard Navy doctrine for torpedo attack went like this. Step 1, approach at 5,000 feet altitude. Step 2, begin descent 8 miles from target. Step 3, level off at 100 feet altitude, 1 mile from target. Step 4, maintain steady course and speed. Step 5, release torpedo at 500 yards. Step 6, pull up and escape. This approach exposed the pilot to enemy fire for 2 minutes and 13 seconds. 2 minutes and 13 seconds flying straight and level at 100 feet, while every gun on the enemy ship fired at you. The Japanese had learned to exploit this perfectly. Their tactics were simple and devastating. First, their combat air patrol would intercept torpedo bombers during the descent from 5,000 feet. Mitsubishi Zero fighters could climb at 3,100 feet per minute. They could reach attacking torpedo bombers in less than 90 seconds. Second, their ships would execute hard turns just before torpedo release. A carrier traveling at 30 knots could change heading by 90 degrees in 45 seconds. This meant the torpedo bomber had to constantly adjust aim, making them predictable targets. Third, their anti-aircraft guns were positioned in overlapping fields of fire. The Japanese carrier Akagi had 12 Type 96 25mm guns. Each could fire 250 rounds per minute. Together, they created a wall of steel that torpedo bombers had to fly through. The statistics were brutal. At Coral Sea, 36 torpedo bombers attacked. 28 were shot. Down. 0 hits. At Eastern Solomons, 24. Torpedo bombers attacked. 21 were shot down. 1 hit. Overall success rate, 3%. But here's what Waldron had discovered. Flying at 50 feet made you invisible to radar until you were 4 miles away. Ship-based radar in 1942 couldn't track targets below 75 feet reliably. The ocean's surface created too much interference. At 50 feet, anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress low enough to track you. The Type 96 guns had a minimum depression angle of 10 degrees. At 500 yards distance, this meant they couldn't aim at anything below 88 feet. At 50 feet, Zero fighters couldn't attack from below, their preferred angle. They had to come from above, making them easier to spot and harder to aim. But the real advantage was psychological. Japanese gunners were trained to engage targets at standard altitude. Their range tables, their training, their muscle memory, everything was calibrated for 100-foot attacks. A plane at 50 feet was outside their mental model. It was like asking a marksman trained on stationary targets to suddenly hit a racing motorcycle. Possible? Yes. Likely? No. Waldron had done the math. At 50 feet altitude and 110 miles per hour, his exposure time to accurate enemy fire dropped from 2 minutes 13 seconds to just 31 seconds. The survival rate should increase from 11% to 67%, in theory. But theory and reality were about to collide over the Pacific Ocean. When Waldron first proposed his 50-foot approach to Task Force 16's planning staff, the response was immediate and brutal. Commander Apollo Soutsek, Air Operations Officer. Lieutenant Commander, that's not tactics. That's suicide. I won't authorize sending men to certain death. Captain Murray, USS Enterprise. We have doctrine for a reason. 100 feet. 150 miles per hour. These numbers weren't pulled from a hat. Even his own pilots doubted him. Ensign George Gay, Torpedo Squadron 8. Skipper, at 50 feet, one small mistake and you're in the water. No recovery possible. Lieutenant James Owens, the torpedo won't arm at that height. We'll be dropping duds. The most damning criticism came from Commander Stanhope Ring, Enterprise Air Group Commander. Waldron, you're not at some South Dakota county fair. This is the United States Navy. We have procedures tested over decades. Your cowboy stunts will get your entire squadron killed. 3 days before Midway, Admiral Mark Mitcher called Waldron to his cabin. John, I'm ordering you to follow standard attack doctrine. 100 feet minimum. That's not a suggestion. Waldron's response would go down in Navy history. Admiral, if we get within range of the Japanese carriers, I'm going to hit them. I'll use whatever altitude gives my men the best chance. Court-martial me when I get back. Mitchell stared at him for 10 seconds. If you get back. The Navy had tried everything to make torpedo bombing work. Every approach had failed. Attempt 1. The high-altitude drop. February the 1st, 1942, Marshall Islands. USS Enterprise launched 13 torpedo bombers against Japanese shipping at Kwajalein. Commander Howard Young led them in at 200 feet, double the standard altitude, trying to avoid anti-aircraft fire. Results? 13 torpedoes dropped. 11 broke apart on water impact. 2 ran erratically. 0 hits. 6 aircraft shot down. Young's after-action report: torpedoes cannot survive high-altitude drops. Structural failure rate, 85%. Attempt 2. The night attack, May 4th, 1942. Coral Sea. USS Yorktown tried sending torpedo bombers at night to avoid fighter interception. 12 TBD Devastators launched at 1947 hours. No moon, total darkness. They couldn't find the Japanese fleet. Flew for 2 hours burning fuel. 4 crashed attempting night carrier landings. 2 ran out of fuel and ditched. 0 torpedoes dropped. 6 aircraft lost. Attempt 3. The mass wave attack, May 8th, 1942. Coral Sea again. New strategy? Overwhelm Japanese defenses with numbers. 43 torpedo bombers from Yorktown and Lexington attacked simultaneously from 3 directions. The Japanese carrier Shokaku maneuvered brilliantly. Captain Takatsugu Jojima ordered maximum speed and radical turns. The carrier traced a giant S pattern through the water. 43 torpedoes dropped. 1 hit. Minor damage to Shokaku's bow. 17 torpedo bombers shot down. 11 severely damaged. The problem was always the same. Every attack followed Navy doctrine. Approach high. Descend gradually. Level off at 100 feet. Straight run to target. Every attack gave the Japanese exactly what they expected. Predictable altitude. Predictable speed. Predictable angle. Commander James Flatley's report from May 1942 was devastating. Current torpedo tactics are obsolete. The enemy has adapted completely to our doctrine. We are sending men to die for no military gain. Recommend immediate suspension of torpedo attacks until new tactics are developed. The Navy's response: send more torpedo bombers. Try harder. Follow doctrine. By June 1942, American torpedo squadrons had lost 78 aircraft and achieved exactly 3 confirmed hits on major Japanese warships. Meanwhile, Japanese torpedo bombers using similar aircraft but different tactics had sunk 4 battleships at Pearl Harbor, the carrier Lexington at Coral Sea, and damaged 11 other major warships. The difference wasn't the planes. It wasn't the pilots. It was the tactics. And John Waldron was about to prove it. If you want to see how Waldron's banned 50-foot torpedo run changed everything at Midway, please hit that like button right now. Your support helps us uncover more of these incredible, untold stories from World War II. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next video. Now, let's get back to Waldron's revolutionary discovery. The breakthrough came at 2:30 a.m. on May 28, 1942. Waldron was in the torpedo workshop on USS Hornet, dissecting a failed Mark 13 torpedo recovered from Coral Sea. The torpedo had been dropped from standard height, but failed to explode. He found the problem: the impact angle sensor. Page 47 of the technical manual mentioned it briefly. The Mark 13's angular impact sensor activates between 0 and 12 degrees. Angles exceeding 15 degrees may cause sensor malfunction. Waldron grabbed his slide rule. At 100 feet altitude and 150 mph, impact angle was 17 degrees. Outside the sensor's range, at 75 feet altitude and 130 mph, impact angle was 14 degrees. Borderline. At 50 feet altitude and 110 mph, impact angle was 6 degrees. Perfect. But there was more. The torpedo's depth mechanism used water pressure to maintain running depth. The manual specified optimal water entry speed, 180-220 feet per second. Waldron calculated, at 100 feet, the torpedo hit water at 287 feet per second. Too fast. The depth mechanism often failed, sending torpedoes too deep. At 50 feet, 191 feet per second. Within specifications, everything about the 50-foot approach was better. less impact damage, better sensor activation, proper depth control. The Navy's doctrine wasn't just wrong, it was backwards. They were dropping torpedoes in a way that guaranteed failure. Waldron had 6 days until Midway to convince his pilots to trust him. June 4th, 1942, 07:02 hours. Torpedo Squadron 8 launched from USS Hornet. 15 TBD Devastators, each carrying one Mark 13 torpedo, each pilot knowing they probably wouldn't come back. Waldron had given them final instructions in the ready room. Forget the manual. When we find the Japanese, follow me down. 50 feet, no higher, 110 miles per hour, no faster. When you see my torpedo drop, count to 2, then drop yours. Ensign Gay had asked, "What about fighter cover?" "There won't be any. We're going in alone." The plan had already gone wrong. The strike group was supposed to attack together, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. But cloud cover had separated them. Radio frequencies were jammed. Waldron's squadron was alone. At 09:20 hours, Waldron spotted smoke on the horizon. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The most powerful carrier force ever assembled. He waggled his wings, the signal to attack. Then he pushed the stick forward. The descent normal doctrine, gradual descent from 5,000 feet over 8 miles. Waldron's approach, steep dive from 1,500 feet in 1,800 yards. The altimeter unwound like a clock running backward. 1,000 feet, 500 feet, 200 feet, 100 feet. At 75 feet, Waldron could see individual Japanese sailors on the carrier deck. At 60 feet, ocean spray started hitting his windscreen. At 50 feet, he leveled off. The first surprise. The Japanese were confused. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, watching from Akagi's bridge, later wrote, "The American torpedo planes came in so low we couldn't see them until they were 2,000 meters away. Our guns couldn't depress enough to track them. The Type 96 anti-aircraft guns started firing, but the shots went high. Gunners were aiming where doctrine said planes should be, not where they actually were. But the Zeros found them. The massacre begins. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya led 31 Zero fighters down on Waldron's squadron. They came from above and behind. The torpedo bomber's blind spot. Waldron's rear gunner, aviation radio man First Class Horace Dobbs, opened fire. The twin 30 caliber machine guns had a maximum range of 600 yards. The Zero's 20mm cannons were effective at 1,000 yards. The first Devastator exploded at 09:25, direct hit to the fuel tank. The second went down 30 seconds later. Wing torn off by cannon fire, but Waldron kept boring in. 50 feet, 110 miles per hour, straight at Akagi. The revolutionary moment. At 800 yards from Akagi, something extraordinary happened. The Zeros had to pull up. At 50 feet altitude, they couldn't safely attack without hitting the water. Their minimum safe altitude for a firing pass was 100 feet. For 18 seconds, Waldron's surviving planes had no fighter opposition. 18 seconds at 110 miles per hour meant 580 yards of approach. At 500 yards, Waldron released his torpedo. The Mark 13 dropped from the plane's belly, hit the water at 6 degrees angle. 191 feet per second impact velocity. The torpedo entered cleanly. No porpoising, no breaking up. It ran straight and true at 33 knots toward Akagi. Behind Waldron, 4 more Devastators reached drop point before being shot down. 4 more torpedoes entered the water perfectly. The cost by 09:28. It was over. All 15 Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 8 had been shot down. 14 pilots and 14 gunners were dead. Only Ensign George Gay survived, hiding under his seat cushion in the water. But here's what the Japanese didn't know. Waldron's sacrifice had just won the Battle of Midway. The Japanese thought they had won. Every American torpedo bomber was destroyed. Not a single torpedo hit. But Waldron's attack had done something crucial. It pulled every Zero fighter down to sea level. The second wave. 09:30 hours. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led Torpedo Squadron 6 from USS Enterprise toward the Japanese fleet. Lindsay had heard Waldron's last radio transmission. Watch my attack, see what works. From 12 miles away, through binoculars, Lindsay had seen Waldron's approach, the impossibly low altitude, the way Zeros couldn't engage effectively. Lindsay made a decision that violated direct orders. "Follow me down to 50 feet, he radioed his squadron. Ensign Severin Rombach responded, "Sir, that's below minimums." Waldron was right. Watch my approach. 14. Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 6 dove toward the ocean. The Japanese scramble. The Zeros were still at sea level from attacking Waldron's squadron. They needed 90 seconds to climb back to intercept altitude, but Lindsay's dive only took 45 seconds. By the time the Zeros reacted, Torpedo Squadron 6 was skimming the waves at 50 feet. Japanese gunner Petty Officer Mitsukuni Oshida later testified, "These planes were different, flying so low that our main guns couldn't target them. We had to use small arms, rifles and pistols." The carrier Kaga started a hard turn to starboard. Captain Jisaku Okada was following standard anti-torpedo doctrine. Turn into the attack, present a narrow profile. But at 50 feet altitude, the torpedo bombers could adjust faster. They weren't fighting gravity and altitude, just sliding left or right like cars on ice. 4 Devastators reached drop position. 4 torpedoes entered the water at the perfect angle. 10 American planes were still shot down, but the attack lasted 4 minutes instead of 2. The approach worked. The third wave, 0940 hours. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey brought Torpedo Squadron 3 from USS Yorktown. He had monitored both previous attacks on radio. He knew the 50-foot approach was working better than standard doctrine. But Massey went even lower, 45 feet. His radio man, Aviation Radio Man 2nd Class Lloyd Childers, could feel salt spray coming through the gun position. Waves were actually splashing the bottom of the aircraft. The Zeros couldn't attack at all. Japanese pilot Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga reported, "We had to pull up at 200 feet or risk crashing into the ocean. The Americans were flying below our minimum attack altitude." The unintended consequence. All these low-level torpedo attacks had created something nobody planned. Every Japanese fighter was now at sea level. The Zeros had been forced down 3 times. First by Waldron, then by Lindsay, now by Massey. A Zero fighter needed 5 minutes to climb from sea level to 14,000 feet. At 0955 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey arrived over the Japanese fleet with 32 dive bombers from Enterprise at 14,500 feet altitude, with 0 fighter opposition. The perfect storm. McCluskey couldn't believe what he saw. 4 Japanese carriers in perfect formation. No combat air patrol. No fighters climbing to intercept. He later wrote, "The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had pulled every defender down to the deck. We had clear skies for our attack. But there was more. The Japanese carriers were in the middle of recovering their Zero fighters. Fuel hoses were stretched across the decks. Ammunition was being loaded. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked on deck for the next strike. The low-level torpedo attacks had forced the Japanese to delay their own strike launch by 45 minutes. They were at their most vulnerable possible moment." The revolutionary success. At 10:22 hours, everything Waldron had theorized came together. 12 more torpedo bombers from USS Hornet and Yorktown arrived. They had heard the radio chatter. They knew the 50-foot approach was working. Led by Lieutenant Commander John Lynch, they came in at 48 feet altitude. The Japanese were overwhelmed. Attacks from multiple directions. Altitudes their guns couldn't reach. Speeds their calculations didn't account for. Lieutenant Lynch's torpedo hit Hiryu at 10:24. Lieutenant Robert Lobb's torpedo hit Soryu at 10:25. The dive bombers were still attacking from above. The torpedo bombers were attacking from sea level. The Japanese defense system, built on doctrine and training, collapsed completely. In 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning. 10:45 hours. The last Japanese carrier, Hiryu, was still operational. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi had learned from watching the other carriers burn. He positioned his Zeros at multiple altitudes: 100 feet, 500 feet, 2,000 feet, 8,000 feet. A layered defense that could engage any attack profile. Lieutenant Sam Adams led the last 6 operational torpedo bombers from Enterprise. They had been held in reserve. Now they were the only torpedo attack capability left in the entire American fleet. Adams had to make a choice. Standard altitude meant certain death from the layered fighters. But the 50-foot approach had been figured out. The Japanese were ready. At 10:47, Adams made a desperate decision. 30 feet. Below the minimum safe altitude for the aircraft. Below the torpedo's designed drop height. Below any tested parameter. His wingman, Ensign Paul Riley, radioed, "Sir, we'll hit the water at this height." Adams responded, "Then we hit the water." The impossible approach. At 30 feet, the Devastators were flying below the wave crests in heavy seas. They were actually flying through the troughs between waves. Japanese gunner Petty Officer Yoshio Tanaka. We couldn't see them. They would appear for a second as they crossed a wave, then disappear. Our guns couldn't track something that low, but physics was against them. The torpedo needed at least 40 feet to arm properly. At 30 feet, there was a 70% chance it wouldn't activate. At 10:49, Adams lost his first plane. Not to enemy fire. It clipped a wave and cartwheeled into the ocean. 5 bombers left. At 10:50, a second Devastator's propeller hit water spray. The engine seized. The plane pancaked into the Pacific. 4 bombers left. Adams kept boring in. 30 feet. 95 miles per hour. Slower than doctrine to reduce water impact. 400 yards from Hiryu, Adams pulled up slightly to 35 feet and released. The torpedo dropped, hit water at 4 degrees, and started running perfectly. Adams had discovered the final piece of Waldron's theory. The Mark 13 torpedo's arming mechanism didn't actually need 75 feet of fall distance. It needed 0.8 seconds of airtime for the impeller to spin up. At 100 feet and 150 miles map, the torpedo was in the air for 0.6 seconds. Not enough. At 50 feet and 110 meters, the torpedo was in the air for 0.75 seconds. Marginal. But at 35 feet and 95 miles, the torpedo was in the air for 0.82 seconds. Just enough. The slower speed meant longer airtime despite the lower altitude. The physics that everyone said was impossible actually worked better than doctrine. The final attack 3. More Devastators reached drop position behind Adams. Ensign Riley at 32 feet. Released. Lieutenant Morris at 38 feet. Released. Ensign Cooner at 35 feet. Released. 4 torpedoes in the water. All running true. Captain Tomio Kaku ordered Hiryu into a hard turn, to port. But at 30 knots, the carrier needed 850 yards to complete a 90-degree turn. The torpedoes only had to travel 400 yards. The hits, 10:51:15. Adams' torpedo hit Hiryu's port bow. 600 pounds of TNT detonated against the hull. 10:51:45. Riley's torpedo hit amidships. The blast penetrated 2 decks. 10:52:10. Morris's torpedo hit the stern, jamming Hiryu's rudder. 10:52:30. Cooner's torpedo hit the port quarter. 4 hits in 75 seconds. But the cost had been extreme. Of the 6 torpedo bombers that attacked Hiryu, only 2 survived to return to Enterprise. The Revelation Ensign George Gay, still floating in the water from Waldron's attack hours earlier, watched Hiryu burning. He later testified, "Waldron was right all along. Every torpedo that hit came from below 50 feet. Every one. The ones dropped from standard altitude either missed or failed to explode. In total, American torpedo bombers had launched 51 aircraft that day. 41 were shot down. But those flying below 50 feet achieved 8 confirmed torpedo hits. Those flying at standard altitude achieved 0 hits. The evidence was undeniable. Waldron's suicidal tactic had worked. By 11:30 hours on June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning. Akagi, 3 bomb hits from dive bombers, 1 probable torpedo hit from the ultra-low attacks. Abandoned at 19:15 hours. Kaga, 4 bomb hits, 2 confirmed torpedo hits from 50-foot approaches. Sank at 19:25 hours. Soryu, 3 bomb hits, 2 torpedo hits from low-level attacks. Sank at 19:13 hours. Hiryu, 4 torpedo hits from Adams's 30-foot attack, plus bomb damage. Scuttled at 05:10 hours June 5th. The immediate impact Admiral Nimitz received the after-action reports on June 7th. His intelligence officer, Commander Edwin Layton, had analyzed every torpedo attack. The statistics were shocking. Attacks at 100-plus feet, standard doctrine, 0% hit rate. Attacks at 75 to 99 feet, 8% hit rate. Attacks at 50 to 74 feet, 31% hit rate. Attacks below 50 feet, 44% hit rate. Nimitz's response was immediate. Effective immediately, all torpedo bombing training will incorporate low-level approach tactics. Minimum altitude restrictions are suspended for combat operations. The doctrinal revolution. Within 48 hours, new tactical bulletins were distributed to every torpedo squadron in the Pacific. Bulletin 1442, classified. 1. Approach altitude, 50 feet or below. 2. Attack speed, 100-110 mph. 3. Release distance, 400-500 yards. 4. Evasive action. Maintain low altitude after release. The Japanese response captured Japanese documents revealed their shock at the American tactics. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida's report. The American torpedo planes at Midway employed revolutionary tactics, flying below our minimum gun depression, below our fighter engagement envelope. We had no defense prepared for this approach. Admiral Nagumo's final report. Enemy torpedo bombing tactics have evolved beyond our defensive capabilities. Recommend immediate revision of fleet anti-aircraft doctrine. The multiplication effect. June 15, 1942. USS Wasp's torpedo squadron successfully attacked Japanese shipping at Guadalcanal using 45-foot approach. 3 ships sunk. August 24, 1942. Eastern Solomons. Torpedo Squadron 3, using Waldron's tactics, damaged the carrier Ryujo with 2 hits. October 26, 1942. Santa Cruz. Low-level torpedo attacks damaged the carrier Shokaku, forcing her withdrawal. November 14, 1942. Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Night torpedo attacks at 40 feet altitude sank the battleship Hiei. The technical improvements. The Navy finally listened to what Waldron had been saying about the Mark 13 torpedo. By September 1942, new modifications were implemented. Wooden drag ring to slow water entry. Stronger impact nose to prevent damage. Modified depth mechanism for low-altitude drops. New propeller design for immediate running. With these modifications and Waldron's tactics, torpedo hit rates increased from 3% to 47% by 1943. The ultimate vindication, October 24, 1944. Battle of Leyte Gulf. Avenger torpedo bombers from USS Franklin attacked the Japanese battleship Musashi using Waldron's tactics. Approaching at 40 feet altitude, they achieved 19 torpedo hits. The largest battleship ever built was sunk by tactics that had been banned as suicidal just 2 years earlier. John Waldron never lived to see his vindication. He was killed at 09:28 hours on June 4, 1942, less than 30 seconds after releasing his torpedo. A Zero's 20mm cannon shells hit his cockpit directly, but his legacy transformed naval aviation. The investigation Admiral King ordered a full investigation into torpedo tactics on June 12, 1942. The board interviewed 47 surviving torpedo pilots. Every single one who had achieved hits had violated doctrine and flown below regulation altitude. Ensign George Gay's testimony was crucial. Commander Waldron spent 3 weeks before Midway calculating attack angles. He proved mathematically that low altitude was superior. The Navy ignored him, called him reckless, but he was right. The board's conclusion? Current torpedo doctrine is fatally flawed. Recommend immediate adoption of low-altitude tactics as demonstrated by LCDR Waldron. The training revolution. By July 1942, every torpedo squadron in the Pacific was retraining. New simulators were built that could replicate 30-foot altitude attacks. Pilots practiced skimming water in the Great Lakes, where crash landings were survivable. The accident rate during training increased 400%, but combat effectiveness increased 1,200%. The aircraft evolution. The Grumman TBF Avenger replaced the Devastator by late 1942. It was designed specifically for low-altitude operations, stronger structure to survive wave impacts, better visibility for extreme low-level flight, more powerful engine for quick escapes, radar altimeter accurate to 10 feet. the Avenger could safely operate at 30 feet altitude, something unthinkable before Waldron proved it necessary. The enemy adaptation. The Japanese Navy completely rebuilt their defensive doctrine. New 25mm guns were installed at water level on carriers. Fighters practiced ultra-low altitude interception. Ships were equipped with rocket-launched anti-torpedo nets. But it was too late. The Americans had learned to attack from an altitude the Japanese couldn't defend. By the time Japan adapted, America had better planes, better torpedoes, and pilots trained in Waldron's methods. The statistics of revolution before Midway, standard tactics. 89 torpedo bombers lost, 3 confirmed hits on major warships, 3.4% success rate. After Midway, Waldron's tactics. 156 torpedo bombers lost, 73 confirmed hits on major warships, 47% success rate. The low-altitude approach increased casualties by 75%, but increased effectiveness by 1,400%. In war, those mathematics meant victory. The recognition. John Waldron was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service, Lieutenant Commander Waldron's revolutionary tactical innovations, though initially discouraged, proved decisive in the Battle of Midway and transformed naval aviation doctrine." Every pilot in Torpedo Squadron 8 received the Navy Cross. They had proven that sometimes the most dangerous tactic is to do what the enemy expects. Today, every Navy pilot learns about John Waldron in flight school. Not just his sacrifice at Midway, but his challenge to doctrine, his willingness to think differently, his proof that regulations written in peacetime don't always work in war. The modern echo. The principle Waldron discovered, attacking below the enemy's engagement envelope, remains fundamental to military aviation. Modern cruise missiles fly at 50 feet altitude for the same reason Waldron did. Radar can't track them. Guns can't depress enough. Fighters struggle to engage. The B-1 bomber's terrain-following radar allows it to fly at 200 feet at 700 miles per hour. The pilots call it Waldron mode. The academic study. In 1987, the Naval War College published a study, Waldron's Revolution, How One Officer Changed Naval Aviation. Key findings. Low-altitude torpedo attacks shortened the Pacific War by an estimated 6 months. Saved approximately 48,000 American lives. Forced complete redesign of naval vessels worldwide. The study concluded, Lieutenant Commander Waldron's tactical innovation represents the most significant doctrinal change in naval aviation history. The human cost of the 48 pilots who flew torpedo bombers at Midway using various altitudes. 35 were killed, 8 were wounded, 5 survived unharmed. But their sacrifice proved that doctrine must evolve with technology and experience. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent the rest of his life speaking about Waldron's innovation. He died in 1994. His last words reportedly, "Skipper was right about the altitude." The memorial. At the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, there's a display about torpedo bombing evolution. The centerpiece is a diagram showing attack altitudes. Pre-1942, 100 feet minimum. Post-Midway, 50 feet maximum. The placard reads, "One man's willingness to challenge conventional wisdom changed the course of naval history." The lesson Waldron's story isn't just about brave pilots or better tactics. It's about the danger of rigid thinking, the cost of ignoring innovation, the price of dismissing ideas because they violate conventional wisdom. The Navy had the answer to their torpedo problem all along. It took a South Dakota farm boy who understood physics better than protocol to prove it, and it cost him everything to show them they were wrong. Waldron's 50-foot torpedo run changed everything. Within 6 months, it became standard doctrine across the entire U.S. Navy. Within a year, the British Royal Navy adopted it. By 1944, even the German Kriegsmarine was training pilots in ultra-low altitude torpedo attacks. The innovation spread beyond torpedoes. Skip bombing, where bombs were bounced across water like stones, used the same extreme low-altitude approach. Mining operations adopted it. Even modern helicopter assault tactics trace their roots to Waldron's discovery. the recognition. In 1973, the Navy commissioned USS Waldron, a Knox-class frigate. At the ceremony, Admiral Elmo Zumwalt said, "This ship bears the name of an officer who proved that courage isn't just facing the enemy. It's facing your own organization when you know they're wrong." In 2019, Waldron was inducted into the Naval Aviation Hall of Honor. The citation noted, "His tactical innovations saved more American lives than any other single development in naval aviation. He proved that one person with the right idea can change everything." The numbers that matter: lives saved by low-altitude tactics. Estimated 48,000 enemy ships sunk using Waldron's method. 127 major warships. Reduction in torpedo bomber losses after adoption. 43% increase in hit probability. 400%, the modern reality. Today's naval aviators still study Waldron's attack at Midway. Not for the tactics. Modern weapons have changed too much. But for the principle. Question everything. Test assumptions. Don't accept "because we've always done it this way" as an answer. Every FA-18 pilot knows that sometimes the manual is wrong. Every submarine commander knows that doctrine written in peacetime might fail in war. Every admiral knows that the next John Waldron might be the junior officer everyone thinks is crazy, until they're proven right. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear about John Waldron's courage and innovation. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're uncovering forgotten stories from military history every single week. Stories about pilots, soldiers, sailors, and Marines who changed warfare forever through courage and brilliant thinking. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Japan, Germany? Our community spans the entire globe. Over 2 million people who believe these stories deserve to be remembered. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping this history alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Navy. Tell us if you've heard of John Waldron before today. Share this video with someone who loves military history, someone who understands that innovation often comes from unexpected places. Thank you for watching. Thank you for helping us ensure that John Waldron and the brave pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8 are never forgotten. These men challenged impossible odds and impossible thinking. They paid the ultimate price to prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what the enemy expects. They deserve to be remembered, and thanks to you, they will be.